again. All right, so this is the same code we had before here. All right. Now we just wrap this in a function. It doesn't need any arguments because it has all the data it already needs. It has the dealer hand. And we just say, hey, our dealer hand value starts out at 0 at forEach. And then we return it. And then we can say console.log the dealer hand is worth dealer hand value. Oh, what did I say? What did I call it? Current dealer hand value. Current dealer hand value. And this time I want to call the function. I don't want the function itself. I want the result of calling the function. And we should get in the console main.js line 90. What is it complaining about? Oh, I still have some leftover code here from when I crashed. Let's get rid of that. Nope, that's what I wanted. Oh, it's this one here. Right? The dealer's hand value is worth 14. I'm calling the function current dealer hand value. If I left off the parentheses, I would be logging the function. The dealer's hand value is worth, that's the function. If I don't put parentheses like this. Now I'm calling the function current dealer hand value. Right? And it's going to return this sum. Question?
How do you get the page display? How do you write that on the page so that it logs like real time up there? Like,
oh, you want it in the page itself rather than in the console? Yeah, you could keep appending to some text content. Ooh. Yeah, so the way I might do this is maybe here at the bottom, let's just make a div with a class of log. Like this. Right? And then in my code, instead of saying console.log, I could say document query selector for .log .text content plus equals. Now I have to use this. The dealer's hand is worth current dealer hand value, call the function. Now at the bottom, the dealer's hand is worth 10, right? And now, if I called this 2 times, right, the dealer's hand is worth 20, the dealer's hand is worth 20, like so. Right? Right? So if you were just trying to assign it, right, you weren't trying to append it, you could do this, right? It's worth 13. Instead of appending, right, if I was trying to like have a log of what was going on, bump, 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 I could append instead of equals, right? This is like saying number equals number plus 5, right? Since this is a string, the text content is a string, I can keep appending to that string. So that's using a DOM element to track a whole bunch of data. If I were trying to make this fancier, I would probably make this a UL with LIs inside of it as a little log function. That's how I would have that output go to the screen rather than to the console log. Right? So this is probably what you're going to do, right? If you had query selector, dealer, hand, value, right? Maybe what you have here is, instead of this, you just have dealer and value. Right, the dealer's hand is worth 14. Or what we had before was this. Right, kind of cheat mode, right? We would probably do this for the player's hand, right? But that's how you would assign. That's how you would assign the value, right?
And it would continue to add as you hit it.
Every time I executed this function, right?
Yeah.
So maybe instead of this being here,
and that's because you put the extra parentheses inside these swirly brackets.
Yes.
Over here.
Yep.
Okay.
So maybe I want to update that screen every time we deal to the dealer. So maybe the very last thing that this does is reevaluates that, right? So every time now I deal a card to the dealer, the very last thing it does is calls current dealer hand value, which adds up the dealer's hand and sets that query selector, right? The dealer's hand. So if I call deal card to dealer again, deal card to dealer up, right? So every time I call this function, right, it does the work of adding another card to the dealer, putting it on the screen, computing the total, and adding it, right? Oh, there's our add again. Blocked, LOL, denied, right? So this is the process of like coming up with a long way of doing something. So maybe you had code that said dealer total equals dealer total equals 0, and you added card of 0 or dealer hand 0 dot value, total equals total plus dealer card bracket 1 dot value, so forth and so on. Or you got an if statement like if the dealer's hand is smaller than 2, do this. If it's smaller than 3, do this. If it's smaller than 4, do this, right? That all works. But what you're going to get used to is when we're dealing with something that's an array and we're trying to loop over that, that's where the forEach comes in, right? And you just have to decide for every element of this array, what work do I need to do? Well, the work I need to do here is add up the value of that hand, right? So you can imagine we might have another function called current player hand value, and that will, instead of going through dealer hand, will go through a player's hand and add that up as well, right? So, right, either you start up with a whole long list of, right, something that looked like, right, we could say let verbose total equal to scores of 0 plus scores of 1 plus scores of 2, right, plus scores of 3 plus scores of 4 plus scores of 5, right? Maybe you had code in your app that looked a little bit like this, right? That's fine. It works, right? It works, right? But right, if all of a sudden we're playing a game that's got like you can have 12 cards in your hand or 30 cards in your hand, right? Your code gets longer. Yeah. The idea of the forEach loop, right? Right. This is our friend the for loop, right? We said, okay, well instead of doing this long verbose mode, let's make a function that can add up a list of numbers. That's cool. Now this function can handle any array of numbers we pass it. But what if we wanted the ability to do more than just add numbers? Maybe we need a function that can multiply numbers, or it can create some DOM elements, right? We created the Suncoast forEach that took the idea of the for loop and extended and said rather than a hard code, right, directly inside of this function, do the adding or the multiplying or the console logging. If we give it a second argument that's a function, we can call that function and say, hey, person who's using Suncoast forEach, you need to tell me what work you want me to do for every element, right? And we work through how this works. We said, well, we don't have to implement that because JavaScript gives it to us. That's called forEach. And all forEach needs on the left-hand side is which array. On the right-hand side is a function that takes one element and does some work. And then we can use that to add up our list. Cool. So I think that covers our, how does forEach work, a guide. We re-explained arguments and brackets. Cool. Let's quickly talk about reduce. So some people found that if we had this, if we had let's score still, yeah. So some people found an answer by Googling and saying, hey, the way you can do this, add up an array, is say, call reduce and pass it a callback function that is score that returns that takes two things. It takes a score and a total, and says return total plus score, and then an initial value of 0, and you get 523. Right? Brain just explodes. Right? So reduce is like forEach with superpowers. So reduce works the same way as forEach. It's going to go through every element of the array, but in a slightly different way. What it's going to do is, whatever this last argument is, becomes the first value for total. Score becomes the first element of the array. So if we ask inside of this thing the first time through, what is score? 14. What is total? 0. We then take 0 plus score and we get 14. We return that. The return of this function becomes the next value for total. So the second time we call this function, total is going to be 14.
Oh, okay.
Score is going to be 98. 98 plus 14 is 112. 100, yeah. So now total is 112. Score is 100. 100 plus 112 is 212. 212 goes back into total. Score becomes 200. 200 plus, right? So the idea is the answer of this function becomes the input to the next one, right? And we loop through until the length of the array, and we're done, right? So reduce works just like forEach, but with this really weird, the output of one step becomes the input to the next. And when you think about the name of this function, we're taking an array and we are reducing it down to its total, right? And the way reduce works is the output of the initial value becomes the very first value of the second argument. The result of this function becomes that, and we move on to the next one. You may have seen this, if you want it really short, because the other rule of arrow functions is that if all your arrow function does is return, you can leave off all of that and just give it the code, and you get 523. Right? Don't pay attention to that. That's a kind of advanced thing. The other rule of arrow functions is if the only line in your arrow function is return and a thing, you can drop the brackets and the return and just give it the thing. So these two lines are equivalent. Right, so this, you may Google search, how do I add up an array of numbers, and it gave you something that looked like this. Reduce thing, comma, sum plus thing, comma, 0, right? And you dropped it in the code and it worked, right?
So
okay. This is the explanation behind that in case you found reduce as an answer.
to do that with this, would we do like dealer hand index dot value?
If we were doing this, I could say this. Return dealer hand reduce card dot value.
Oh. See, that's what I couldn't figure out.
And these would be the same.
Okay.
Return reduce total plus card value. We get back an object and undefined. Why did we get an object undefined? Dealer hand reduce card and total plus card value. And total starts out with 0. Is it backwards? Total card? Yes, I got the arguments backwards. All right. Sorry, the total comes first and the card comes second.
Okay.
So this is essentially the same as the longhand for each. So like the longest way of doing it is saying total equals card of 0 dot value plus card of 1 dot value, card of 2 dot value, right? Then the next shorter way is doing a for loop. Then the next shorter way is doing a for each loop, and the shortest possible way is using this funky thing called reduce, right? So figure out the one that like makes sense for you now, and like be cool with that, and like then study the one that's a little bit more advanced, right? And once you get cool with that, study the one that's more advanced. People will use a reduce like this if they're summing some numbers. The problem is that reduce for something more complex than adding or multiplying some numbers can get really wild. So you'll find reduce used sometimes. Right, so the idea is reduce starts out with a collection of things and ends up with one thing. So if you're starting out with a big collection of things and you're going to end up with one thing, that's where reduce comes into play. Which is a good introduction because we're going to talk, maybe we'll do it at Review It too. We're going to talk about other functions in JavaScript that work a lot like forEach and reduce that do different things, like finding elements in an array, right? Like map and find and some of those things. So there are more functions that work like forEach that go through collections of things and do work for us. If we're cool with forEach, right, or if at least we're like kind of comfortable with what forEach is doing, we can talk about things that kind of build on top of that and transform.
How comfortable is kind of
comfortable? Do you think you can read the code for forEach and kind of understand what it does? Yeah? So if you mean like, I get that it's going through each thing of the array and it's giving me each element one at a time, and I'm doing some work inside, right, which in this case has the effect of adding that card's value to dealer hand value, and when I'm done, that will be the total. If you can, like, my brain grasps that, but I don't know if I could write it for another thing, we're cool, right, because we're going to get to practice implementing those, right? And the idea of the code wars that we do are going to reinforce these things, because maybe for the code war, you're going to use a forEach loop to go through every element in the array and do something. Or you're going to use map and filter and some of the things we're going to talk about this afternoon to go through the array, transforming it or finding elements. Like once we can understand or appreciate that forEach goes through an array, giving us an element and calling some work, whether we do it as an anonymous function or we do it as a named function, that opens up this ability to deal with collections in a really interesting way. That's the next thing that we need to learn, so that we can go talk about APIs, so that we can then build things with APIs, so we can then go build things with React. So that's kind of the path we're going. Let's quickly look, Alan, at your question, which was your count player. What's your GitHub? Yes. And this is your repositories, blackjack, and you wanted to look at your
what I was trying to do, and you kind of answered. See, I was trying to,
yep.
Where I have the count player,
mm-hmm.
I was trying to just put that up top as let count player equal open, then down there do count player arrow, and then do my if statement in there. And it was.
Yep, but the way you're doing it is perfectly right. At the very top, you're declaring the function. Let count player be a function that takes no arguments and does all this work. Right, and this is kind of like the long way of doing. We've learned this is the long way of doing the totaling, but it works, right? If there's 2 elements in the array, add them up and set the text content. If there's 3 elements, add them up. If there's 4, if there's 5, if there's 6, I would implore you to go back and try and use forEach here, right? But then, if all you want to do is every time you do some dealing, call count player, you just call it like this. That's perfectly correct.
So that's why I don't need to let down here, just at the top.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, and you can use let or you can use const for this, right? Okay. For functions, either is fine for now, right? But if you all turned in something that looked like this, double thumbs plus up, awesome, right? Even though this is, let's see, 21 lines of code that can probably be reduced down to 3, right? Like you worked it out, right? Long code that is at least like nicely formatted and things are named well, right? This is called count player. Cool. I might call it something like total of player's hand, but count player is pretty close, right? And I can read the code and I can say if this, if this, if this, if this, if this, and it works. That is better than slick code that does not work, right?
Why does the statement except for it initiates the dealer's turn after 5?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So if you can get to something like this, yeah, be super happy, right? And then we'll always see a way of making it more efficient, right? But if you can work out how to do it long ways, right, then we can refactor, we can transform the code into something that uses a forEach.
There is no if-else statement.
There is.
Okay, so I was looking for an if-else statement. To do that, I should have been looking at forEach.
Yep. You can just put an else, right? So you can put an else, right? Let score equals to 42. If score is greater than 42, console.log boop. Else console.log boo. Right. We then say score is 99, and we do this if statement. Right, we get whoop. Right. If this condition is true, do the first block of code.
Right.
Otherwise, do the second block of code.
Right, which would help me farther down in my code to refactor that.
There's also an else if.
That's what I was looking at.
That takes another, else if score is greater than 99. Else if. Oh, and I need clear. Else if. In Ruby, it's else if. It's like this, else if, like so. Right. So now, if the score is greater than 42, else if the score is greater than 99, do this. Else if, you can chain them along. Right. So if
dealer hand is less than 17, else if greater than.
So now if score is 100, then we do this. Right, we should get. Oh, except I want it more than 42, but not more than. No, this is a bad example. If else, otherwise, if score is less than 10, because otherwise our numbers work. So if if the score is more than 42, boot. Otherwise, if the score is less than 10, boo. If we do score is 9, we should get a boo, right? I don't particularly like big chains of else ifs because I think they get really hard to read and also really hard to indent. I think in your case, exactly how you did this was fine, right? Because only one of these is going to be true, right? So the player hand length can only be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. If you're doing this where you're just saying comparing a number to this, there's also the switch statement.
That's the one I found switch.
So if you find switch statement, right? So if our variable has, if expression is papayas, if we switch on expression, we can say, when the case that expression is oranges, do these lines. When that is either mangoes or papayas, do this line. Otherwise, default, do this. So a switch statement is like a super powerful if-else, where you can have multiple values that do the same code, right? So this code here is going to be run if this variable is mangoes or papayas. So you'll use a switch statement when you find yourself having a lot of if on the same variable, right? Just like Alan's if player hand length, player hand length, player hand length, player hand length, player hand length. If you have a whole series of if statements and they're comparing the same thing, that's a good example that you could use a switch statement. So you could have wrapped this in a switch and said switch player hand length, case 2 do this, case 3 do this, case 4 do that, case 5 do this, case 6 do this.
Instead of using if-else.
If. Yeah, instead of using if or if-else, right? But the real way of doing this is reducing it down to using forEach, right? Because we don't actually have 6 different conditions. We just have 6 different lengths of something, right? And we're kind of doing the same work, so we're going to do that in a forEach. But those are a couple other ways you could have implemented this. Yeah, yeah, and switch would work really well for Rochambeau as well, right? Because you can do different styles of cases for rocks and papers and scissors. Cool. So I would suggest if you want some practice with this, see if you can go back to your blackjacks and replace some of this logic using the forEach loop like we did here. I'll push the code, and hopefully the videos are a video, especially one where it crashed. And see if you can reduce some of the summing kind of code down to forEach, or other places where you kind of had repetitive code. See if that code applies for forEach. Play around with it, see what works, see what doesn't work. And then this afternoon we'll talk about a couple other versions of forEach that have some other magic powers.
If we've already commented and closed, there's a save on that. So if I break my blackjack, I have to okay.
Yep. Yep. As long as you've committed and pushed, right? You do more work to break it, right? And you're like, you come to me like, oh man, I tried doing forEach, I totally busted everything. I will show you how to go back to what was in GitHub. Right? That's why committing and pushing is so good. Cool. All right. And then if you all have questions or you've got stuff on your code you wanna review, come find me during lab time. Where is OBS?
You're gonna push that code without the comments in there for kind of note.